The mood around the Detroit Lions right now is complicated. A franchise that only a few years ago looked like one of the fastest rising teams in the NFL suddenly finds itself navigating a tense and uncertain offseason. For fans in Detroit, the opening week of free agency felt less like the beginning of a new era and more like the closing of a beloved chapter. Key veterans departed. Familiar locker room leaders moved on. And the first few days left many wondering if the Lions were standing still while the rest of the league sprinted forward. For a team that finished the previous season with a frustrating 9-8 record, the expectation from the fanbase was clear. This was supposed to be the offseason where Detroit reloaded, addressed its weaknesses, and made a serious push back toward contention in the NFC. Instead, the early headlines centered around players leaving town. Veterans like Alex Anzalone, Taylor Decker, Amick Robertson, and David Montgomery, players who had become part of the identity of this team, walked out the door. Watching those departures unfold created the sense that the roster was being dismantled rather than improved. But once the initial wave of free agency passed, a different strategy started to reveal itself. Rather than chase big-name signings or splashy contracts, Detroit began quietly adding pieces that could reshape the roster in more subtle but meaningful ways. The Lions brought in 7 new players during the early phase of free agency: Teddy Bridgewater, Isaiah Pacheco, Tyler Conklin, Cade Mays, Larry Borom, Roger McCreary, and Christian Izien. On paper, none of these moves broke the internet. None of them dominated national headlines. But taken together, they reveal a clear philosophy about where this franchise believes it needs to go next. And that philosophy is centered on youth, versatility, and hunger. Dan Campbell has always talked about building a roster full of competitors, players with something to prove and a chip on their shoulder. If you look closely at Detroit's early free agency moves, that identity is everywhere. Many of these players are young enough to grow with the team, but experienced enough to contribute immediately. More importantly, they arrive in Detroit with motivation. Some lost starting jobs. Some were traded. Some simply need a fresh start. In a league where motivation and opportunity often collide to create breakout seasons, the Lions appear to be betting on exactly that formula. Nowhere is that strategy more obvious than in the secondary. Entering the offseason, the defensive backfield looked like one of the most uncertain areas on the roster. Injuries to key players created instability, and the Lions risked heading into training camp relying heavily on inexperienced options. That scenario became even more concerning as the early free agency period unfolded without major defensive additions. Then came the signing of Roger McCreary. McCreary might not have been the biggest name on the free agent market, but he brings a skill set that fits Detroit's defensive identity almost perfectly. A former second-round pick out of Auburn, McCreary built his reputation as a physical and instinctive defensive back who thrives in press coverage. During his college career, he developed into one of the most respected corners in the SEC, eventually earning first-team All-American honors before entering the NFL draft. His early years in the league reflected that pedigree. In Tennessee, he was immediately thrown into a man-heavy defensive scheme and asked to play both inside and outside corner. That versatility made him valuable, but it also meant constantly adapting to new responsibilities. When the Titans shifted to a more zone-oriented defense under a new coaching staff, McCreary's role changed again. His snap counts dipped, and eventually he became part of a mid-season trade to the Los Angeles Rams. That trade ended up creating a strange but intriguing final chapter to his season. McCreary suffered an injury on his very first snap with the Rams and spent weeks on injured reserve. But when he returned late in the year, he quietly delivered one of the most efficient stretches of coverage football in the league. Over the Rams' final games and playoff push, he allowed just 4 receptions for 28 yards while playing significant snaps across multiple positions. That kind of production in a limited sample caught the attention of teams around the league. For Detroit, it represented the perfect buy low opportunity. If McCreary performs the way the Lions believe he can, he could quickly emerge as a key contributor in the slot. And with competition from younger defensive backs like Ennis Rakestraw and Christian Izien, the Lions are creating a training camp battle that could ultimately raise the level of the entire secondary. And if you're enjoying this deep breakdown of the Detroit Lions offseason and want more analysis like this throughout the season, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a Lions film breakdown or roster update. Another addition that might prove far more important than it initially appears is veteran tight end Tyler Conklin. At first glance, signing a third tight end may not seem like a priority move. But once you understand how Detroit's offense is evolving under coordinator Drew Petzing, the reasoning becomes much clearer. Conklin's football journey itself is a story of persistence. Growing up in Michigan, he started his college career not even as a football player, but as a basketball athlete at Northwood University. Eventually, he walked away from that scholarship opportunity to pursue football at Central Michigan as a walk-on. Over time, he earned both a scholarship and a starting role, eventually developing into a reliable pass-catching tight end. That development led to his selection in the 5th round of the 2018 NFL Draft by the Minnesota Vikings. During his years in Minnesota, Conklin steadily expanded his role, culminating in a productive season where he recorded over 60 receptions. From there, he joined the New York Jets, where he quietly became one of the most consistent tight ends in the league, posting 3 straight seasons with more than 58 catches. The last season of his career was less successful with the Los Angeles Chargers, where a breakout rookie eventually surpassed him on the depth chart. But for the Lions, that situation opened the door to acquire a veteran player who still has plenty left to offer. The real significance of Conklin's arrival lies in Detroit's offensive philosophy. Petzing has long been an advocate for heavy offensive formations built around multiple tight ends. Specifically, the use of 13 personnel, 1 running back, and 3 tight ends creates constant matchup problems for defenses. When executed properly, it forces defenses to either stay small and risk getting overpowered in the run game or get bigger and slower while defending the pass. For that strategy to work, the tight ends on the roster must be capable of doing everything. They must block effectively in the run game, run routes against linebackers and safeties, and adapt to multiple alignments. With Sam Laporta already established as one of the most dynamic young tight ends in football and Brock Wright providing reliable blocking ability, Conklin adds a third balanced option that allows the Lions to fully unlock those formations. And that opens the door to an expanded playbook. It allows Detroit to dictate tempo and personnel matchups rather than reacting to what defenses show. In today's NFL, where defenses constantly rotate sub-packages and disguise coverages, having the flexibility to shift between power running and spread passing without changing personnel is a major strategic advantage. Beyond the skill positions, the Lions also made a fascinating move along the offensive line by signing tackle Larry Borom. On the surface, his 1-year contract worth $5 million might look like depth insurance. But when you examine the financial structure of the deal, it becomes clear that Detroit expects Borom to compete for meaningful playing time. Borom's contract ranks around the middle of the league for offensive tackles, placing him in the range typically reserved for high-end backups or borderline starters. That suggests the Lions see him as at least their 3rd tackle, someone capable of stepping into the starting lineup if injuries strike. There's also another potential role that makes Borom especially valuable. For the past several seasons, Detroit has frequently used an extra offensive lineman in heavy formations near the goal line or in short yardage situations. With longtime jumbo package specialist Dan Skipper now transitioning into a coaching role, the Lions needed someone capable of filling that spot. Borom's size, strength, and experience make him a natural candidate for that role. And with Petzing's offensive tendencies leaning toward heavier formations, that 6th offensive lineman could become an even more prominent part of Detroit's identity. Of course, even with these additions, the biggest question facing the Lions remains on the defensive side of the ball. Losing multiple defenders during the first week of free agency created a noticeable talent gap on the depth chart. The departures of players like Roy Lopez, Al-Quadin Muhammad, and Alex Anzalone left holes that cannot be ignored. But if there is a clear pattern emerging from Detroit's strategy, it's patience. Rather than spend aggressively during the first wave of free agency, the Lions appear to be targeting younger players on shorter contracts while maintaining flexibility for the draft and later market opportunities. That approach can be frustrating for fans who want immediate answers, but it also reflects a front office that believes roster construction is a long game rather than a sprint. And that long-term thinking may ultimately define whether this offseason succeeds or fails. Because while none of these moves individually transform the roster, together they represent an attempt to reshape the team's competitive identity. Younger players, more versatility, more internal competition. It's a gamble, but it's also a calculated one. The Lions know they are not starting from scratch. They still have foundational pieces on both sides of the ball. What they are trying to do now is build a roster that can grow together over the next several seasons rather than simply chasing short-term fixes. Whether that vision becomes reality will depend heavily on what happens next, both in the later waves of free agency and in the upcoming NFL draft. For now, the early returns suggest something subtle but important is happening in Detroit. The Lions may not be making the loudest moves of the offseason, but they are making moves that could quietly reshape the foundation of the roster. And if those hungry, motivated players deliver the way the front office believes they can, the story of this offseason might look very different once the games actually begin. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Detroit Lions offseason strategy and want more breakdowns of roster moves, draft prospects, and game analysis throughout the season, make sure you subscribe to the channel and join the conversation in the comments about which free agency move you think will have the biggest impact.